Welcome to the Coffee House, where in the next hour, there's plenty of cause for cynicism about corporate ethics. But are nonprofits any better? We'll chat with Peter Berns of the Maryland Association of Nonprofit Organizations. Never heard of the Mirant Corporation? Well, it's just the biggest polluter by far in Montgomery County, Maryland, so says a group of protesters. The Bush re-election victory has the Democrats and their base searching for answers. We'll hear the thoughts of the AFL-CIO's David Boundy. Plus, a visit to the 8th Pyramid Atlantic Book Arts Fair and learn about the making of artful books. Poet Holly Bass ponders why she cleans up after people in public. Blogger and author Jen Lemon offers a reverentially irreverent perspective on Christmas. We've got a cappella music from the Russian choral group Svetlana, and curator Arthur Wheelock takes us on a guided tour of the new Terborch exhibition at the National Gallery of Art on the Coffee House. Welcome to the forum at the Coffee House. It's come to this. Say business ethics at a dinner party and someone will snicker or dismiss the term as an oxymoron. And not without reason. The culture of greed is good did not die with the merger mania and SNL lootings of the 80s or with the Ken Lay and Bernie Ebbers style intrigues of the 90s. Job one, whether it's at Ford or any other for-profit corporation, was, is, and always will be to enrich its shareholders. And if that means cutting ethical corners, well, welcome to the real world of global competition. Our ethical expectations are way higher, though, for not-for-profit businesses. These are the good guys, right? The ones doing charitable and public-spirited work? Well, it turns out that nonprofits have their own ethical challenges. Ask Peter Berns, Executive Director of the Maryland Association of Nonprofit Organizations. Welcome, Peter, to the Coffee House.
It's good to be here.
First of all, what is the Maryland Association of Nonprofit Organizations?
We're a statewide association of more than 1,530 nonprofit organizations, every size and stripe of nonprofit all over the state. And our work as an association is to help our member organizations to improve their operation, do a better job serving the public.
Okay, we started out by talking about ethical challenges to nonprofit organizations. What are some of the ethical challenges that nonprofits face?
Well, in the nonprofit community, we talk about both ethics and accountability. And the primary issue in terms of ethics and accountability of nonprofit organizations is seeing that whether the organizations are actually serving the community in a meaningful way. Nonprofit organizations, the very definition of a nonprofit organization is that it has to serve a public good rather than advancing private interests. So we look first and foremost to see, are these organizations really fulfilling their mission as organizations?
And your organization has developed guidelines for nonprofits in order to assist them in fulfilling their mission.
That's right. The nonprofit community in Maryland is actually a leader in the country. We've developed standards for excellence, which is an ethics and accountability code for nonprofit organizations that includes 8 general guidelines and 55 specific standards that define how a nonprofit organization ought to operate if it's well governed and responsibly managed. And our standards cover everything from how the board functions to whether the organization has a system in place that enables them to measure, to evaluate their programs, to whether they ask their customers, participants in the programs, how they're doing. So it covers all different aspects of the operation of organizations.
Okay, let's step back a little bit in time, because some people might say that this is in reaction as opposed to a proactive move on the part of your organization and other nonprofits. That in recent years, perhaps beginning most notably with William Aramone and the United Way scandal, up to more recently, I think we noted the Nature Conservancy problems in the opening, that there have been problems with nonprofits, especially in terms of self-dealing of executives of the organization. Tell me a little bit about the nature of that, how it differs perhaps from for-profit corporations and what's being done about it?
Sure. Well, self-dealing has occasionally been a problem with nonprofit organizations, and our program really was born in the wake of the scandal with William Arimony, and nonprofit leaders in Maryland, considering those events, really struggling with what we as a community could do to make sure that kind of thing doesn't happen again, or to really make clear to the public what we really stand for. But self-dealing, those types of situations are examples where
perhaps we should fill in some blanks here for people who have forgotten what this is about. We're talking about financial fraud. We're talking about tax fraud. We're talking about he was also convicted of conspiracy.
In a nonprofit context, some of the worst scandals have involved situations where the organization's leaders have started to use the organization's money for their own private purposes, as opposed to keeping that money committed to whatever the public purpose of the organization is, whatever the mission of the organization is. So if an executive or a board member starts to use that money to live high on the hog, or take trips, or there have been situations where they've been entertaining others inappropriately. That's an abuse of the public trust. That's an abuse of the nonprofit organization. And those are the kind troubling situations for the nonprofit community, because those types of scandals with some nonprofits really put a shadow over the rest of the nonprofit community.
Now, there are other situations that skirt the ethical line a little bit more fluidly. For instance, for most nonprofits, the executives are paid well below the rates of the for-profit sector. But in certain areas, hospital administration, university presidents, what have you, they're paid fairly competitively with the for-profit sector. But a lot of people would say that it's not in the nature of the nonprofit sector that people should be making hundreds of thousands of dollars in salary.
Well, nonprofit organizations have to compete for talent for running the organizations, and I think you'll generally see that even in the large nonprofits, the salaries are still less than what these people could be making in the for-profit universe. But there's certainly the rule that applies in nonprofit organizations is the salaries can't be excessive. Frankly, the bigger...
How do you determine what's excessive?
Well, the IRS has the Internal Revenue Service has some very specific rules for how you do that. And basically what's required is that the salary has to be set, there has to be a market basis for the salary. And a board of directors of a nonprofit organization has to go through a very specific procedure to approve the salary. And sometimes what you see in these cases where there is arguably excessive compensation is that folks weren't paying quite as much attention to the process that they need to go through, and they weren't paying quite as much attention to doing the market comparison in order to make sure that that salary is justified. When you talk about salaries, though, in nonprofits, frankly, the bigger problem is that for the vast majority of nonprofit employees, people are being paid less than they ought to.
I happen to run a nonprofit that is produces this program, and I have never been paid a penny for it, nor has anybody associated with the program. We've been doing it for 9 years now. We bear a grudge.
Well, about two-thirds of the nonprofits in Maryland and nationally are all volunteer organizations for whom no one's getting paid. But there are, for a third of nonprofits, those are organizations with employees that have anywhere from a half-time employee up to large institutions that may have thousands of employees.
Another distinction, I said at the beginning that these are the good guys, right? And a lot of them are doing environmental work, or they're doing public welfare work, things that I think most of us would consider to be contributing to the public good. But to be a nonprofit doesn't require that your mission statement devote oneself to the public as opposed to an industry interest, for instance, does it?
Well, no, actually it does. I mean, to be a 501c3 tax-exempt organization to which a contribution would be deductible as a charitable contribution by the donor, you have to be organized and operated to further a public purpose, and not the interests of, not private interests, and not the interests of a narrower group.
Or an arguable public purpose.
Well, a public purpose that's recognized under the tax law as being entitled to tax exemption. That generally it has to be charitable, educational, religious, has to be involved in testing for public safety, amateur, international sports competition. I mean, the tax laws enumerate specific purposes that are recognized for tax exemption. You distinguish that group, though, from business leagues, chambers of commerce, which are also tax-exempt groups, but contributions to those aren't tax-deductible.
Let's talk about religious groups, because one of the issues that emerged from this most recent election was the line that gets drawn between a 501c3 organization is allowed to participate in the political process, but only in a very limited way. And as a religious group, there was a lot of criticism of the way the Bush administration worked through churches around the country to encourage them to support the president, but they couldn't do that in name. But there was the insinuation, at least, that a vote for Kerry was a vote for the devil. And so should organizations that do that be stripped of their nonprofit status?
Well, the current rules prohibit a 501c3 charitable, educational, religious organization from engaging in any partisan political activity. And we're very strict in advising our members and other nonprofits that they need to stay well on the one side of the line and not cross it. But that means that they can engage in some election activities. They're allowed to help register voters. They're allowed to help get out the vote. They just can't do anything to express an approval for one candidate as opposed to the other. And if they do, they risk loss of their tax exemption. One of the problems is, though, that of course the IRS has very limited resources, and it's very rare that you see them actually crack down on anyone for abusing those rules.
Very quickly, Brian Gallagher, who is the current successor to William Aramone at United Way, recently made a comment that there are too many nonprofits in the country and that it's getting too hard for the government to regulate nonprofits. Do you agree with that?
Well, this is a growing industry. There are in Maryland, for example, about 100 new nonprofits approved by the Internal Revenue Service every month. And there's increased competition among those organizations. We always encourage organizations, encourage folks who are thinking of starting a nonprofit to look at every other opportunity before they start something new, and encourage those organizations that are already in business to look at how they can work with other organizations rather than duplicating.
Okay. Well, many thanks, Maryland Nonprofits' Peter Berns, for joining us in the coffee house. It's fine to agree in the abstract to higher ethical standards, but as for-profit executives will whisper in private, it's a whole other thing to actually act on moral principles. We're glad to have Maryland Nonprofits to guide us in this process. I'm Mark Cohen in this forum. Appreciate it.
We're here today, a couple of dozen people, to bring attention to the fact that the Mirant Corporation is contaminating our fish with mercury, accelerating global warming, destroying our forests with acid rain, giving us code red smog days, giving children asthma, and the company has shown no sign of wanting to join us in reducing the pollutants that come out of those smokestacks back there the way other states around us are doing. Maryland is falling behind.
Mirant is by far the largest polluter in Montgomery County. Nothing else comes close. The pollutants emitted by this plant are equal to the amount of pollutants emitted by every single registered vehicle in Montgomery County. 600,000 registered vehicles pour as much nitrogen oxide, CO2, and other pollutants into the air as this one power plant.
So we want Maryland to catch up and do better, but the Mirant Corporation at every turn in Annapolis and at the federal level blocks meaningful coal-fired power plant legislation to clean up these toxins. And so we're here today to call on the people of Maryland and the Maryland General Assembly to pass legislation to protect us from Mirant.
There is so much that Mirant can do. The technology is available. Why don't they do it? Because they don't have to. Why don't they have to? Because the federal government is not enforcing the law. We need Mirant to act, and if Mirant won't act, we need the state government to act. We need Maryland to do what North Carolina and Virginia have already done. Legislation was introduced in the last session of the General Assembly. It didn't pass. That's okay. Bills sometimes take several sessions to pass. Legislation passes when the people demand it. I hear a rumor that there may be some civil disobedience this morning.
All right. Ma'am, I'm asking you to stand up and move out of the room. Okay? You're under arrest. Stand up.
Welcome to WorkLife at the Coffee House. Many of you know that unions devoted a great deal of energy and resources in trying to elect John Kerry president. But what exactly did unions do, and how effective were they in delivering votes to Senator Kerry? I'm pleased that we have with us today David Boundy, who spent most of his waking hours for months working on this campaign. David is the Deputy Political Director of the AFL-CIO. David, it's nice to have you with us today, and welcome to the Coffee House.
Thank you, Fred.
So why exactly was the labor movement so heavily invested in this campaign? What was the motivation?
The reason that the union movement was so invested in this campaign, the reason that so many people devoted so many hours and worked so hard to get rid of President Bush is the simple fact that on working family issues, he's been perhaps the worst president that we've had in my lifetime, probably going all the way back to the Depression. I mean, on issue after issue, he has not been on the side of workers. For example, since he's been president, he's overseen, since the first time since Herbert Hoover, we've seen an actual loss of jobs in this country. It's a remarkable thing when you think about it. The country is a growing country, more immigrants, more people coming here all the time, and yet at the end of his 4 years, for the first time since Herbert Hoover, there are fewer jobs in this country than there were when he began. There are 44 million Americans without health care, 4 or 5 million more than when he began his term. And then lastly, just to sum up, we could also talk about overtime pay. This is a president who really fought hard to eliminate overtime pay for working Americans in this country over the period of the last couple of years.
Okay, so there was clearly a lot of motivation there. When did the labor movement get involved in the campaign? When did you start becoming engaged in this campaign?
Well, the labor movement has been engaged all along, because one of the things the labor movement does is it fights on issues on behalf of its members. And because President Bush's policies, eliminating collective bargaining rights, for about 250,000 workers, again, trying to eliminate the 40-hour work week and replace it with, a comp time bill that would give people 80 hours over 2 weeks. All sorts of complicated things, but all really geared to taking some rights that basic workers have and away from them. We've been fighting for the whole time from his very first day in office to stop what he's been trying to do, his agenda. But in real terms, in the past 2 years, we were putting together a plan of how we would mobilize regular workers into voting against Bush and to elect a different president.
Well, so what was that plan? What was your strategy in this campaign? What was the basic game plan that you adopted going into it?
The basic game plan that we put together was very simple. What we try to do is we try to give regular workers, through their union, some real information, credible, documented, cited information of where the president stands on key issues. And then once we had a candidate, John Kerry in this case, we would simply say, this is where John Kerry has stood on this issue, this is where George Bush is. And then we would get that information to workers in the worksite is the best way. And as crazy as it may sound, in an era when millions and millions of dollars, hundreds of millions of dollars are spent on TV, advertising, our most effective way is simply a leaflet with credible information presented to a worker in the workplace.
Face-to-face.
Face-to-face conversations. And then beyond the workplace, of course, we do mail and you do phones. And we also have an aggressive door-to-door campaign where we go knocking on union members' doors and, again, trying to educate them about where the candidates stand on key issues.
So your campaign then was focused on your members. That was
legally, our campaign is entirely focused on our own internal membership, union members and their families.
Well, was this approach, these strategies that you adopted, was this new in this campaign, or is this something that's been developing over the years? Or
it's not new in this campaign. It's been developing over the past several years, really since 1996. It's a very aggressive approach, but we've never really put together something like we did this past cycle. We added some new elements. We added more accountability into how we got each of these aspects of it done, trying to make sure that we hit the right number of doors, that we made the right number of phone calls, and that we followed up and made sure that people were talked to one-on-one in the workplace.
Well, obviously your efforts weren't sufficient to elect your candidate, but that, of course, doesn't mean that labor wasn't potentially a significant force in this election. How significant was the support of labor for Senator Kerry?
If you look at the exit polls, on election day, and exit polls are polls taken as people exit, the voting booths, you would see that union members and their families, although only really, maybe 10, 11, 12% of the voting age population in the country actually comprised 1/4 of all votes cast. So we were able to put together a program where we vastly outperformed what our numbers in real terms are. We were 1/4 of every vote cast in this cycle.
And did union voters support Senator Kerry, or I assume they did, but to what extent? Do you have numbers
union
on
voters voted, on election night, what we did is we went in and took a poll of our own members. Several thousand members were interviewed on election night. And what we learned is that, union members by 2-to-1, 65, I think, to 33 or so, voted for John Kerry.
And do you have numbers on how that broke down in the target states?
In battleground states, and those battleground states are where the campaign was really fought, where there was enormous amounts of money again spent on television, and where President Bush and Senator Kerry went to again and again, places like Pennsylvania and Ohio and Michigan and Minnesota. In those states, the John Kerry among union families actually even outperformed the overall numbers, and he, I think, it got 68% of all union votes in those states.
So, do you have any sense of what, if there wasn't without the union vote in this election, what this election might have looked like?
If you actually take the union votes out of the election, what you would see is that among non-union voters, I think that Bush would have won the election 55-44 or something. So there's an enormous difference between a union member and a non-union member. Just imagine it. You have two folks living in the same street. They may even have the same job. They're both electricians and live right beside each other, except one is a union member and one is not. The union member gets some information about how this election will affect his family economically. The other family gets their information from TV, from newspapers, and that's really it. And maybe there's whatever the campaign does to reach out to them. They don't get any additional source of information about how the union affects, how the election will affect their lives. The union has something at stake, provides that information to the member, and now you have two people who maybe attend the same church, they have children in the same little league, they go to the same school, they may even have the same kind of job, but they vote entirely different ways.
So what then are some of the lessons that you've drawn from the election? I assume you're analyzing the results fairly carefully, and what kind of conclusions about what went right, what went wrong, and possible future implications for how labor might be involved in politics?
Well, that's the big question. What we really want to do is we want to, if you look at this, you could say one thing very clearly, that there aren't enough union members in the country. If there were more union members, John Kerry would be president, and I think that working families would be better off in the long term. What we need to do is organize. There needs to be a more effort placed on organizing more workers. We need to go back and retool our own program, but in the end, the union's role is to represent and fight for its members.
Well, what about looking beyond union members, how they voted in this? What happened in this election? What's your sense now of what this result was about? I know we hear every day and on the news and in the papers, different theories. What's labor's theory about what happened here, or at least your theory?
Well, I mean, if you don't have to look at any theories, you can actually just look at the numbers. And going back to what some of those exit polls show us, one of the things that's really remarkable is that among the people who voted in 2000, people who voted in 2000 and then voted again in 2004. Now remember, in 2000, the election was a dead heat between Al Gore and George Bush. A 50-50 election. If you look at just the people who voted last time and didn't vote and voted again this time, George Bush, I think, won by 54 to 46 or so. Among new voters, however, John Kerry really won those significantly. So what
do you have any numbers on that about?
I couldn't give them to you off the top of my head, but among new voters, I think John Kerry won by maybe more than 10 points, and that's how the election was as close as it was.
So there was an actual shift from Gore voters to a significant shift from people who voted for Gore in 2000 who voted for Bush in 2004.
Right.
And the size of that difference would have been much greater were it not for the votes of new voters. Is that what I'm hearing you saying?
That's correct.
So I mean, you've indicated a little bit, but specifically in terms of politics, what kind of programs are you thinking about developing? Anything new on the drawing board in terms of how you're specifically going to approach the politics of this?
What we're going to have to do is we're just going to have to go back and fight in behalf of our members, try to make sure that we preserve their right to overtime pay, that we preserve Social Security as best we can. It's what we have to do is, members pay dues money so that we can, advocate in their behalf and try to win them, a bigger slice of the economic pie.
Any organizational innovation? I've heard of a couple of ideas that are on the drawing board in terms of new ways of developing organizations, political organizations within the labor movement.
There's a lot of talk about different ways that the union movement should be organized and different ways that we need to restructure ourselves to grow and to be more dynamic. All those things are being discussed, and hopefully by 2008 we'll be united again and be ready to fight hard so that we can elect a president who will deliver a better economic life for Americans.
Well, thank you, David, for helping us understand what was apparently a remarkable effort by the labor movement in the recent elections. Even more remarkable in that evidently it wasn't enough. I'm Fred Feinstein, and this has been WorkLife.
The Pyramid Atlantic Book Arts Fair began with a mission to bring together veteran and emerging artists in a setting where there could be conversation and dialogue about the artist's book. So the books that we have at the 8th Biennial Book Arts Fair are not going to show up in P. Dalton because they are not made in massive numbers. They are made with the intention to show an audience what the visual verbal is all about. What I mean by visual verbal is that we take someone who knows how to write, and the concept of language, whether it be poetry or it be the letter forms itself, topography, are instrumental in moving space so we come to the next concept. Then if we put those words aside and just look at the visual book, visual images, we can interpret and have an exchange that is equally as rich without text at all. So an artist book might be something that's all about words or all about image, or it's the combination.
I started out with woodcuts that are very large. They're 22 by 30. And then I did some collagraphs that were intended to be the multicolored print. But when I finally printed them all, I decided they were much better as separate units. And I wrote a text that's based on the story of Adam and Eve to go with the book. And it's wood type. and I printed everything on an etching press. And one of the advantages of that, especially with the wood type, was I was able to use thick felts and get it to print a little better than it prints in more traditional presses.
Birthing a book takes a lot of awareness and consideration and research and perseverance. And then suddenly the book will be born. And it's like any other contemporary work of art. It can be in any style, any ism, any mode, any shape, any size, any price.
I started that book 1.5 years ago with the woodcuts, and that took me about 4 or 5 months. Then I worked on the collagraphs, and that didn't take as long. Then I printed the type over a period of several months last winter and printed the woodcuts. And then I took a break because I moved. And then I toned them to get some color and to help seal the ink up. And then I bound them only a few months ago, and they're not completely done. I've got 15 copies all done, and I have to print 105 more woodcuts.
A large run of an artist book would be 1,000, and that means probably that it would be done or could be done as an offset book, or it could be done as a limited edition hand-set type letterpress book, or it might be done in combination with photography and silkscreen. So it wouldn't be larger than that. And some of these books are very accessible. You know, they're $30 and $40 if they're done in offset. A lot of sales are done at book fairs. A lot of sales are done online. A lot of sales are done through websites. I think that you'll find the book community very inventive in the way they market and find their buyers. I mean, we say William Blake was the first person to make an artist book. Others will debate, well, maybe it was a monk that had something around his belt. Whatever we think was the first one, we know now that there's a lively context, a huge context for the printed word and the published word at this point, but on a small scale.
I am genetically predisposed to be a domestic. My grandmother and her mother, I'm not a domestic. I am not even a tidy woman. In my own home, I only clean when absolutely necessary. Yet I walk into public bathrooms and begin to clean the toilets. After I wash my hands, I wipe the sink dry and keep drying until a whole row of sinks gleam. I can't help myself. In restaurants, I clear crumbs from the table of people sitting next to me before the waiters have a chance. I do not accept tips. In bathrooms, I sing a happy song while I work. I do this when no one is looking. I do this for the sheer joy of cleaning that which does not belong to me. I do not know why I still do this.
Welcome to the Willing Spirit at the Coffee House. Some of the most engaging voices in our country's ongoing conversation about religious life are not heard in pulpits or on the radio, but rather on the web. There are bloggers out there. That's people who write weblogs or online journals, which anyone can read. There are folks who speak through that forum daily to larger audiences than most preachers in our community. Jen Lemon is one of them. Jen's a Tacoma Park at-home mom by day, but by night she weighs in on her blog, jenlemon.com, on topics as diverse as the spirituality of parenting, the moral challenge of genocide, and the future of the church. Over 4,000 people from around the world read her blog each month. Jen's newest project is a self-published booklet called The Soul Sister's Guide to a Very Merry Christmas. And it's unlike anything that you might read in the holiday section of Barnes & Noble. Jen's writing is somehow both irreverent and reverent at the same time, and it's incredibly refreshing. Jen, thanks for coming to talk to us here at the Coffee House.
Thank you so much for having me.
Jen, I know that this booklet this zine was not put together last month. You must have been thinking about this a long time ago. What was the origin of this, and how did you start thinking about it?
Well, my sister and I knew we wanted to do a writing project together, but we weren't sure what the topic should be. And so my sister just asked me in July. It was the middle of hot summer, and she said, "What is it that we're thinking about in July?" And the answer came to us both instantly. We just said, "Christmas." And we laughed because this is probably an unusual answer for most people, but we both, we have a large family. Our in-laws come from large families, and it takes us from July till about now to get ready for Christmas.
Okay, but I know that I'm probably not the only one out there that starts thinking about Christmas right about now, on like about December 5th, 6th, 10th, maybe December 21st.
Yes.
And for a lot of us who start at that date, Christmas sort of comes and attacks us. It overwhelms us, and it's hard to be thoughtful or planful about it in any way. You've put a lot of thought that you've expressed into this booklet about how to bring your values and the things you care about in the world, how to express those during Christmas time. I wonder if you'd just say a word or two about that. How do some of those things come to play?
Well, Christmas is a crazy time, even if you're thinking about it in July, and it can get away from you. But there's certain things you just have to do. You're going to buy gifts, you're going to, prepare your decorations, and those simple things that you're going to do anyway, you can do in a very purposeful way. For example, if you're going to buy gifts with your kids, you can talk about who you're buying for, what would that person like, really trying to focus their attention on what would be just a really great gift for that person. And kids get into it. If you really ask them probing questions like, "Come on, do you really think that your brother wants a Barbie for Christmas?" They'll come up with a better answer, And also you can talk about where you're going to shop and talk about the values represented in those places. When you're honoring local artists or places that honor indigenous artists from other parts of the world, that's a good conversation to have about kids, where we get what we're going to buy.
And what about some of the justice angle that I know comes through so clearly in your writing on your blog? You're a person who speaks not just about how to sort of be kind to your children, but how to talk to your kids about how to be kind to the world. I wonder if you bring some of that sort of concern for the world outside of your family into play in some of the conversations you've had with your family this Christmas.
Yes, well, Advent is a season of waiting, and I've tried to make the point to my children, Madeline, who's 6, and Carter, who's 3, that a lot of people are still waiting for a Christmas season that's peaceful, that's calm, that isn't full of war and very painful things. And so one of the things we're doing this season is we're making a little Advent altar where we'll reflect on waiting for justice in the world. And we have collected these old magazine articles about the Sudan, and we're cutting them out and collaging them and putting them up on our altar, and we're about halfway through right now.
Jen, wait a minute. Where are you installing an altar with pictures of the Sudan, and how is that fitting into your overall holiday decoration scheme?
We're a little bit behind on the overall decoration scheme because we're obsessed with the altar right now, but we have an old fireplace. We rent an apartment that has a fireplace that is completely unfit for fires, but it has a beautiful mantle, and so we're using our mantle as like a central kind of place. And when the Christmas tree comes, we'll be all about that, but until the Christmas tree gets here, we're working on this altar. And the kids are really into it because we're picking up things from nature, we're cutting, collaging, and it's their expression of art too.
So this mantle, even before you've put in other kinds of decorations into your home, this mantle has become a focus for your family's discussion about how the world is waiting for justice?
Yes, I mean, it sounds strange that kids would even be into that, but I think it has a lot to do with just you as a parent taking the lead. So for the last week, my living room is just completely trashed, and I have all these magazines out that I'm cutting and clipping and pasting. And after a while, your kids start to notice, and then they want to cut and paste and do the same thing. And so I think just that project taking over our living room has been a form of influence for my kids.
Well, I hope as people are listening to this and they hear somebody talking about the way that they're preparing for the holidays is to invite their kids to do a collage about, justice in the Sudan. I hope people start to realize a little bit about what's so distinctive about your blog and about jenlemon.com and your voice. I wonder if there's some way, though, in which, folks who aren't going to be making the altar in their home, if there's some things that just in terms of the way they interact with the office party, the sort of things they need to do at home, having the neighbors over, if there's things there that are ways in which they can sort of live out some of the sort of values of justice and of the pursuit of peace that you're talking about.
Well, we live in a time where people are so polarized, especially around religious issues, and Christmas can be a great time to point out to your kids that not everyone is celebrating Christmas. Some people are celebrating Kwanzaa, some are celebrating Hanukkah. And as we're doing our Christmas celebration, we can share some of our good cheer for my particular family's tradition, but we can also invite other people to tell us more about their tradition. And this has been very fun for us in the fall with Muslim friends that we have who want to talk about Ramadan and get together and maybe feast at night. And my kids are really intrigued by that. And I think it's a wonderful lesson in tolerance to say that we are all worshiping in our different expression through our different faith. We're really trying to honor the sacred that we found in our own traditions. And so it's not just about our holiday. It's about all of the other holidays that are to be honored and celebrated at this time.
So you don't celebrate Christmas as a Christian-only holiday? Do you invite folks from other religions that you know into your, to come to your Advent altar? And,
yes, we do. It's been really funny this year because we've had a lot of openness of our friends and neighbors who've said, okay, what are you doing this year? Can we come? Can we do it? And it hasn't been really that hard because I think peace is a universal value that transcends a lot of different religions, and people recognize that and want to be a part of that it's it really is about peace, and true peace comes when we can be deeply respectful and deeply honoring of other people and the way that they worship and the way that they believe.
I wonder though, what made you put this all together into your own magazine? Like, why not just leave it with, your friends and your family?
Well, I'm the kind of person that have a lot of great ideas, and I start half of them, and most of them don't get finished. And my sister kind of shared that sentiment. We thought, well, if we did this scene and if we published hundreds of copies, it would kind of hold our own feet to the fire to do the things that we think about doing and don't always follow through on. So there's nothing like having a few hundred copies running around in your friends, family, your neighbors, and people you don't even know to have a little accountability. So Jen, how's your Advent altar? You cannot not do your Advent altar.
Because you wrote about it
because you wrote about it in the book.
Okay.
So actually, the book itself has been a form of spiritual practice for me to follow through on the things that I really believe in, that I really want to make special for my holiday season. And already it's December 6th and we're doing pretty good.
I wonder if you'd recommend that to other people, to sort of write some of their own intentions for what they would do for the holiday out and self-publish them in some way.
Just from personal experience, I've never done anything like this before, and it has been so exciting for me and my sister for us to work together as a team and to see the things that we wrote in print. It's been a wonderful journey, and it's formed me, I think, in a way that is making me more the person that I want to be, that I'm not just saying something, but I'm actually doing it. So I highly recommend it.
Well, that's incredible, because I know for a lot of us, we feel like the holidays pull us off from where we feel like we'd most like to be. If people want to find a copy of this, where would they find it?
Well, they can go to www.soulsistersunite.com, and the Tacoma Book Exchange in Tacoma Park is also carrying our zine.
Well, Jen Lemon, thanks so much for joining us. If you'd like to hear more from Jen, check out her blog at jenlemon.com. And the Soul Sisters Guide to a Very Merry Christmas is, as she said, available at soulsistersunite.com. I'm Heather Kirk-Davidoff, and this has been The Willing Spirit.
Welcome to the Artistic Eye. This month we're taking a look at the first Gerard de Borg exhibit in the United States, which is showing at the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C. through January 30th. Gerard de Borg was one of the leading Dutch artists of the 17th century. His paintings established a new direction in Dutch art and influenced many artists who came after him. His most innovative painting shows figures engaged in daily routine activities. To learn more about the exhibit, we're talking to Arthur Wheelock, curator of the show.
De Borg is one of the most wonderful of all Dutch painters. Been fascinated with him throughout my entire career. We have an exhibition with about 52 or 3 paintings, and while many of the paintings do come from U.S. collections, both public and private, others come from England and from Germany and the Netherlands and France. I mean, it's really quite a wide range. One of the interesting things about de Borg is that his paintings were copied practically more than any other Dutch artist. But nobody ever managed to paint the sense of shimmering quality of satins that de Borg managed to do. Vermeer was quite influenced by de Borg. Despite these superficial similarities, they are quite different, I think. And one difference is that de Borg, from the very beginning of his painterly career, was interested in being a genre painter, painting scenes of daily life, and he did his portrait world as well. De Borg really was more interested in the human dynamics in these relationships. He liked to see the interaction, a momentary quality. So in that sense, their paintings are really quite different in character. It's part of, I think, the magic of de Borg. He likes to suggest these relationships between entities in this paintings, whether between lovers or between a boy and his dog or a mother and a child. That is something that he really brings. It's really Ter Borch who brings this dynamic to Dutch art. You can't help but thinking that Ter Borch really liked dogs. I mean, they appear in painting after painting in this most wonderful way. I actually can't think of a better dog painter in the history of art than Ter Borch. The whole question of modern elements in Ter Borch's paintings is really fascinating. It may well be that these emotional relationships are something that he focused in on as a way to demonstrate that quality. I mean, the term modernity, or to paint in a modern manner, was a recommendation that his father gave to him in a letter in 1635. And it's one of the first times that term gets, we find that term in Dutch art. All Dutch artists are painting fictions, and this is, of course, one of the confusing things about Dutch painting, because it looks so real. None of these artists, whether they're landscape artists or genre painters or still life painters, really painted from an existing reality. They all compose things in their studios, and this is, of course, when they do that, they make choices. Ter Borch plays with this a lot. Early on, you can see that he's deriving a lot of his compositions from other artists, from pictorial sources that he has seen, whether in London or in Spain or in Antwerp or in Amsterdam or Haarlem. You can see kind of a tradition. At a certain point, when he settles down in Zwolle and Deventer in the 1650s, I think all that changes, and there he becomes much more set within the framework of the family life, the family existence. And particularly interesting in this regard is his relationship with his half-sister Gesine, because Gesine is a poetess, and she's writing these wonderful poetry albums that at the same time that Ter Borch is painting these paintings. And many of the ideas and many of the sort of moods and even the situations that she is describing in her poetry albums are reflected in the types of paintings Ter Borch is painting in those years. Well, Gesine was fascinated with issues of love. And it's interesting that in many of the paintings that Ter Borch paints in these years, Gesine is the model for the woman. Now, this poetry album, which is in the Rijksmuseum, Rijksprintercabinet in Amsterdam, is a fascinating document about all of these issues. And among the many pages are a couple that are devoted to color, description of color. And it's a wonderful page where there's a whole list of colors. Once you start thinking along these lines, color symbolism, what was the color symbolic equivalent in Gesine's poetry, then that seems to reinforce and strengthen the sense of the composition and the story that's unfolding in the painting itself. There are certain paintings where the color does play a pretty dramatic role. For example, the National Gallery has a wonderful painting called The Suitor's Visit, where the woman has this wonderful orangey red jacket and a white satin dress, which stands out quite vividly. If you read Gesine's color symbolism, there the red, which for her represents cruelty or revenge, starts to add another dimension. And the woman playing the Throbo seated at the table is in blue, quite strikingly blue, and she doesn't look so pleased. So the jealousy component of blue might well be relevant to the choice of putting her in blue rather than in yellow, for example. The Gallant Conversation is a painting that has evoked so much discussion over the years. And I must say, it's a painting I really don't know what is going on. So let's get that off straight. Okay, I don't know. It's a wonderfully evocative painting that raises lots of discussion, lots of sort of questions. And who is the gentleman? What does his gesture imply? Why is the chaperone? I believe it's a chaperone, drinking out of the glass of wine. What is the body language of the woman seen from behind represent? Why is that dog slinking off to the side the way it does? Why is the bed right behind the figure? The questions surrounding this painting are ones I think were also discussed in the 17th century. I have no question that Ter Borch saw these paintings as a means, or that the collectors who owned these paintings saw them as a place of gathering point for people to come and discuss and to question and to admire the satin, but to raise all these various questions. The painting of the rider on the horse is, I think, one of the most compelling images in the whole show, and it's sort of amazing that he painted it when he was 16. It's just, and it reminds you right off that Ter Borch grew up in the company of soldiers. So it shows right from the very beginning that of his awareness of the world about him, and finding a pictorial image within that world is really quite stunning. This exhibit, I think, brings to all of us the work of one of the great Dutch artists of the 17th century, not very well known to the American public, but certainly one of the most diverse and influential artists of the time.
What relevance does artwork like this have today? We can catch a glimpse of lives that were lived a long time ago, and perhaps not that different from the lives that we live today. For the Coffee House, I'm Welmoed Laanstra.